If Mr. Glackens thus sees his nature, he must enjoy life far more than the ordinarily equipped human, for there is a riot of tone in his vision, remarked art critic Arthur Hober in 1910. Hober was referring specifically to William Glackens' 1908 painting Racetrack, but this riot of tone can be seen in many of Glackens' works of that and subsequent years. William Glackens, American realist and impressionist, is not a well-known artist today, but was an important painter and illustrator in his day. His work influenced numerous other artists of his generation, as well as specific developments in early 20th century American art. He was friends with artists Robert Henry, John Sloan, and Maurice Prendergast, and collector and philanthropist Albert Barnes. He was one of the painters known as the Eight because of a sensation-causing exhibition of his and the work of other artists that year. He was active with the Society of Independent Artists in New York City and helped plan that city's famous Armory Show of 1913. William James Glackens was born on March 13, 1870, at the home of his parents Samuel and Elizabeth Glackens, located at 3214 Sansom Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. At 15, Glackens enrolled at Central High School, where his artistic training began, and met fellow students Sloan and Barnes. In 1892, Glackens attended the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where Sloan introduced him to Henry, with whom he later shared a studio and who became one of Glackens' closest friends. In 1893, Glackens, Sloan, and other Academy students began calling themselves the Charcoal Club, and as a group explored subjects in their work other than those offered at the Academy, such as painting a nude model. Glackens also began producing landscapes in the 1890s when he produced one of his earliest oil paintings, 1893's Philadelphia Landscape. In 1894, Glackens' work was displayed publicly for the first time at the Pennsylvania Academy's annual exhibition. He subsequently produced works such as Factory Scene and Autumn Landscape. In the summer of 1895, Glackens, Henry, along with other painters, began nearly a year's travel in Europe. In France, Belgium, and Holland, Glackens studied paintings by Edouard Manet, Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Rembrandt, and Frans Hals. His knowledge of their work is evident in paintings such as Circus Parade, On the Quay, In the Luxembourg, and others. Glackens moved to New York City in 1896 and worked as a newspaper illustrator and cartoonist, as did artist friends George Lukes and Everett Shinn. He worked for McClure's magazine in 1897 and subsequently, during the 1898 Spanish-American War, was sent to Cuba to illustrate events for news articles. By 1900, Glackens, Sloan, Shinn, Lukes, and Henry distinguished themselves by depicting realistic scenes of everyday city life that presented people of different classes, including immigrants and beggars, the dirt and unsavory components of city life, and they became known as the ashcan painters. In 1901, Glackens exhibited at the Allen Gallery, New York, with Henry and Sloan, and began to garner positive reviews. That same year, he painted one of his most celebrated works, At Mukan. By 1906, he produced Tugboat and Lighter, Seated Actress with Mirror, and Dancer in Blue, and began turning away from the subject matter depicted by other ashcan painters. In February 1904, Glackens married Edith Dimmick, and 2 years later they went to Europe on their honeymoon. Glackens painted a great deal during this time and furthered his study of European painters. The couple returned to New York later in 1906, and in July of 1907, Mrs. Glackens gave birth to a son, Ira. In February 1908, the works of Glackens and 7 other painters were exhibited at the Macbeth Gallery in New York. Sloane, Shin, Lukes, Henry, Arthur B. Davies, Ernest Lawson, and Maurice Prendergast. The National Academy of Design had excluded some of these painters' works from its annual exhibition, which led to the organization of the 1908 show. Glackens showed 7 paintings, including The Shoppers and Racetrack. The exhibition was a public and critical sensation and success, and traveled to several other cities, including Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, and Newark. At this time, Glackens' work shows the influence of the French Impressionists and Post-Impressionists that he had seen in Europe, such as Monet, Renoir, and Vincent van Gogh. Glackens' riot of tone is most evident in paintings like Wickford Low Tide, and after the success of the 8 and other exhibitions, he became increasingly well known. His schoolmate Barnes had an immense interest in art, and besides purchasing works by Glackens, in 1912 Barnes sent Glackens to Paris to purchase works by Paul Cézanne, Maurice Duny, Vincent van Gogh, Pablo Picasso, Camille Pissarro, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and Alfred Sisley. These works became the basis of the famous Barnes Foundation collection, now housed in Philadelphia. Later, in 1912, Glackens had his first solo show at the Madison Art Gallery. In 1913, as a charter member of the Association of American Painters and Sculptors, Glackens served as chairman of Committee on Domestic Exhibitions for the International Exhibition of Modern Art, better known as the Armory Show. The avant-garde works of European artists, such as Marcel Duchamp and Paul Cézanne, surprised and outraged the American public at the same time that it made modern American art seem old-fashioned and retardataire to connoisseurs. On December 6, 1913, in New York City, Mrs. Glackens gave birth to a daughter, Lena. And over the next several years, the family spent a lot of time on Long Island, in Connecticut, and near Conway, New Hampshire. Glackens produced a number of paintings in New Hampshire, including Home in New Hampshire and House in Conway. Beginning in 1925, the family traveled extensively in Europe, mostly in France, spending more time abroad than at home. His work demonstrates his interest in capturing scenes of everyday life. Breakfast Porch shows Edith, Ira, and Lena taking their morning meal, and Bowler's La Ciotat depicts men at leisure in the south of France. Glackens had often depicted still lifes in his portraits, such as in 1911's Girl with Green Apple. In the late 1920s and the 1930s, he turned more of his attention to still life painting. When Glackens was in his 60s, his health had declined, which may have contributed to his interest in studio pieces and still lifes. Many of these 1930s works depict flowers, as in Garden Chair and Flowers in a Quimper Pictures. The small, untitled painting, which is known as Still Life with Paint Tubes, is perhaps William's last work. He died on May 22, 1938, the year the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York organized a memorial exhibition of his work which opened that December. Ira Glackens inherited many of his father's works, and before Ira's death in 1990, he bequeathed nearly all of them to what is now NSU Art Museum, Fort Lauderdale. With his wife, he also founded the Sansom Foundation, which has subsequently given hundreds of Glackens paintings, drawings, photographs, and sketchbooks to the museum, which is now the largest repository of work by Glackens in the world. The museum welcomes scholars and the general public to the museum to enjoy and study its important art and archival collections of Glackens' work.